Hello Revolution students, and welcome back to another video on the Russian Revolution Area of Study 1. In this video we are going to look at World War I and how it contributed to the February 1917 revolution and the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II. So let's get into it. There are a number of key issues facing the Russian people during World War I. These included inflation. So between 1914 and 1916, average earnings doubled while the price of food and fuel quadrupled. So the average Russian person effectively could only buy half as much as they could prior to World War I with their wage. I got that stat from Michael Lynch. I'm going to have a few other stats here which you can use in your responses from him as well. The next issue facing the Russian people were food shortages. So, for example, in Petrograd by February 1917, the people of Petrograd were receiving 300 wagon loads of grain instead of the 1,000 that they needed to survive. It was a similar story in Moscow. By February 1917, they received on average below 700 wagon loads of grain per month. Before the war, they were receiving 2,200 wagon loads of grain. I got those stats from Michael Lynch as well. The food shortages themselves. In Russia at this time, the Russian peasants' agriculture was producing as it had prior to World War I. So there was no problem with actual agricultural production. The problem was getting the food from the countryside to the cities. So the transport system had collapsed. By 1916, 575 stations could no longer handle freight. So even if food could actually get to these stations, then it couldn't get offloaded and taken to the cities. So there are three key issues facing the Russian people. The Tsar, Nicholas II, he was responsible for these issues, ultimately responsible for running the economy, for the transport system and so forth. So his credibility was being tested because of these problems. A key decision that he made at this time contributed even further to undermining his credibility in the eyes of the Russian people. And that was when he appointed himself Commander-in-Chief of the military on the 22nd of August 1915. When he did that, he became responsible for the performance of Russia's military in the war. So he took all responsibility for both the victories of the Russian military and its defeats. However, it was getting defeated more often by the Germans than it was actually winning against them. And as a consequence, his leadership took a hammering. When he appointed himself Commander-in-Chief of the military on the 22nd of August 1915, he went to the front and he left his Tsarina, his wife, and Rasputin to effectively run the civilian government. So, from August 1915 right up to February 1917, Tsar Nicholas II was at the front. He spent the majority of his time at the front, leading the war effort, and as a consequence, the Tsarina and Rasputin were running the civilian government. This was a problem because the Russian people didn't like either of them. Many of them saw the Tsarina as the German woman, and they believed that she was spying for the Germans during World War I, which didn't make her a very popular leader at all. The fact that she was then had a close confidant in the form of Rasputin, who was called the Mad Monk, undermined her credibility even further. These two effectively ran the civilian government, and they appointed and dismissed government ministers, more often than not determined by the loyalty of those ministers to the Tsarina and Rasputin. The government became unstable. There were lots and lots of different ministers, and this further eroded the Tsar's credibility as a leader. And in particular, it lost the support of the aristocracy because the aristocracy formed, it was the aristocrats who became the ministers, and they were just getting fired willy-nilly. And the aristocracy were the Tsar's closest supporters, the most important supporters in some ways. So losing their support meant he had very little support within Russia itself because the majority of the Russian people didn't support him either. This process that the Tsarina put in place of firing and appointing ministers as she wished was called ministerial leapfrogging. And there is a good stat there you can see. So, for example, there were 4 prime ministers between 1915 and 1916, which made the government very, very unstable. So another consequence of the close relationship between Rasputin and the Tsarina was that lots of political pornography was produced at this time. And you can see an example of one of these political pornographic cartoons that were produced at the time, showing Rasputin and his hold over the Tsarina, his close relationship and influence over the Tsarina. What this political pornography did was that it desacralized the image of the Tsar, and desacralization means that the Tsar lost his image as being divinely appointed by God to rule over the Russian people. And this undermined both his and the Tsarina's credibility even further. The final key decision that the Tsar made, which undermined his authority within Russia leading up to the February 1917 revolution and during World War I, was to refused to work with the Progressive Bloc. And you can see that the Progressive Bloc was an alliance of a majority of the Duma deputies of the 4th Duma. It was formed in August 1915, and by August 25th, 1915, 300 of the 420 Duma deputies were a part of this bloc. This Progressive Bloc was an alliance formed in order to, in the minds of these deputies, save the Tsarist regime from a revolution. It was made up of deputies from across the political spectrum, left-leaning socialists right up to right-wing nationalists. They formed it because they feared that the Tsar's very poor leadership of the country was going to lead to a revolution, and they wanted to stop it. By the end, though, by February 1917, even these members, these Duma deputies, members of the Progressive Bloc, many of them had had enough of the Tsar and went over to the revolutionaries. So the Progressive Bloc, as the war went on, they became more and more critical of the Tsar. They voiced criticisms within the Duma of Tsarist rule. The people on the streets heard these criticisms, read about them in the newspapers, and this led to further an increase in social tension and an undermining of the Tsar's authority as well. Okay, let us now have a look at a couple of historical interpretations about how World War I contributed to the February 1917 revolution. And the first one is from Richard Pipes, and he writes, in August 1915, Nicholas took 2 decisions which many contemporaries regarded as a death sentence on the dynasty. One was to dismiss Nikolai Nikolaevich and assume personal command of Russia's armed forces. So that's when he appointed himself commander-in-chief of the military on the 22nd of August 1915. And the other was to prorogue the Duma. And what prorogue means is that even though the Duma it existed, he stopped it from sitting on a number of occasions. So he didn't dissolve it, but he stopped it from sitting, and this made the Duma deputies even more critical of the Tsarist regime. Okay, our second historical interpretation is from Sheila Fitzpatrick, and she writes, the First World War both exposed and increased the vulnerability of Russia's old regime. The public applauded victories but would not tolerate defeats. When defeats occurred, society did not rally behind its government, but instead turned sharply against it, denouncing its incompetence and backwardness in tones of contempt and moral superiority. This suggests that the regime's legitimacy had become extremely shaky and that its survival was very closely related to visible achievements or, failing that, sheer luck. And I suppose it's that first sentence there in the quote, which is the key one. The First World War both exposed and increased the vulnerability of Russia's old regime. So this event was a key factor in leading to the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II in February 1917. Okay, I hope you have found this video on how World War One contributed to the February 1917 useful for your study of the Russian Revolution Area of Study 1, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.